All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Cornelis Bennema. Dr. Bennema teaches New Testament at the London School of Theology and has written several books, including his brand new Imitation and Early Christianity, Mimesis and Religious-Ethical Formation, out now on Eerdmans. In this book, he explores the concepts of mimesis and imitation in early Christianity and how imitation is central to Christian ethics and discipleship. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Bennema, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be here, and thank you very much for your invitation. And I look forward to our conversation here.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about the book, and I've had some New Testament scholars on the show before that were actually like blurbed for your book that on the back cover, and so and the book was great. A lot of the themes that I love to discuss, I think you really highlight well in that. But before we actually get into the content of your book, just tell my audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
All right, thank you. So I am Dutch, and perhaps you can hear that from my funny accent. I did my theological studies here in the UK, then moved to India, where I taught at a postgraduate seminary in Bangalore for 11 years. And we then moved to a theological school in Wales in the UK, where I taught for 8 years. And then in 2021, I moved to London School of Theology. And I teach New Testament here and head up the research department. And over the last 20 plus years or so, I developed three major research areas. The first one is the Johannine writings in general. The second one is character studies in biblical narrative. And then the third one, early Christian ethics. And usually, I seek to publish 2 books and some articles in a particular research area before moving on to a new one. So early Christian ethics is my latest research area, although I started it in 2012. But besides imitation or mimesis in early Christianity, I've also looked at virtue ethics, wealth ethics, and character formation. So that's a little bit about myself.
So you talk about how you really like to, throughout the course of your career, focus on a particular subject and put out some research and literature on that. What drew you to this book in particular? Like, what was attractive about the concept of mimesis so much that you wanted to write an entire book on it?
Thank you for the question. Well, we have to go way back to 2011 when I had identified a research leave project on identity and behavior in the Johannine writings. And at the start of my research leave, I wanted to clarify briefly for myself a kind of a formula that I had noted in John's Gospel, which goes like this: just as Jesus did, the disciples should also do. And I was really struck how often this phrase came up in relation to various Johannine topics, such as the foot washing, the love command, mission, and unity. Take the famous love command in John 13, for example. If Jesus had simply said to his disciples, I give you a new command, love one another, that would probably have been clear enough for us all. But Jesus adds to this phrase, just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. And the significance of this is that the love command is not given in a vacuum, but proceeds from a precedent. In other words, the disciples' love for one another is based on their personal experience of Jesus' love for them, as they have, for example, experienced in the foot washing. And I then started to note a pattern in the Johannine writings where Jesus regularly sets the example that the disciples can then imitate. And as I began to explore this, it got a life of its own, and I actually never returned to the original project. Instead, I started to explore the concept of mimesis or imitation, first in the Johannine writings, resulting in a monograph with T&T Clark that came out in 2017, and then more broadly in early Christianity, resulting in the book that we are now talking about.
So let's talk about the concept of mimesis in particular, because there are probably some people listening that we've used this phrase a couple of times. When we are referring to the concept of mimesis, what do we mean by that? It's central to your book. Honestly, it's like the major theme of your book. But what does that word actually mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just a little bit of background, and we may come back on that later. But in Greco-Roman antiquity, mimesis originally referred to the representation of nature through the fine arts, like dance, painting, sculpture, poetry, etc. But over time, it spread to the realms of religion, family, and education to express the imitation of God, parent, and teacher. So, for example, if I go to the countryside and I paint a landscape, my painting is a mimicry or imitation of reality. Likewise, if I make a sculpture of a live model in my studio, I'm engaging in mimesis, in making a copy of the original. But the result of mimesis or imitation need not be a one-to-one likeness, an exact replication like cloning. It's important to understand that for the ancient Greeks and Romans, mimesis was not so much about complete likeness or exact reproduction, but more about creative corresponding representation. In other words, mimesis was a creative reproductive process, even though there would be a close correspondence between the original and the copy. Now, the term imitation, in the narrow sense of reproducing a particular action, can be seen as a subset of mimesis. But I also use imitation in the broad sense of it being a process, so actually more or less synonymous to mimesis. So imitation or mimesis is a creative hermeneutical process where someone closely observes an exemplar and discerns what exemplary actions to reproduce in order to become a more virtuous person. And as the concept of imitation in Greco-Roman antiquity spread to the realms of religion, family, and education to express the imitation of God, parent, and teacher, there was also cross-fertilization with Jewish thinking. And then the concept found its way into early Christian writings. And in early Christianity, imitation was almost exclusively an ethical concept. That's to say, early Christian writings present the imitation of virtuous behavior of an exemplar, especially Jesus, in order to become a better person, to become more like the exemplar. So imitation is, as it were, a means to moral development, in that the goal of imitating Jesus is for a person to become Christ-like. And as such, imitation goes to the very heart of Christian discipleship, as it were.
And I do want to start with the historical background of the concept of imitation that you've already touched on. And you talked about how this was an idea that was pervasive in the Greco-Roman world, but it was also picked up in a Jewish context as well. So what are some of the specific ways in which Greco-Roman thinkers would have understood the concept of mimesis? And then how does that translate into the Jewish context, which would ultimately shape the New Testament?
Well, let's start with Greco-Roman antiquity, because that's where discourse on mimesis originated. So as I mentioned earlier, mimesis originally referred to the representation of nature through the fine arts. But then it started to spread to other realms, like religion, like family, and education. But even so, the broader context of imitation was Greco-Roman society. And the primary concern was how to live well as a citizen. In the Greek city-state or polis, and in Roman society, the basic social unit was the family or household. And since the family functioned as a microcosm of the polis, the spheres of family and civic education often overlapped. And imitation became a crucial mechanism in moral and civic education, where the imitation of suitable exemplars, especially from one's family, help people in how to live well in the Greek polis or Roman society. And when I was examining a whole range of Greco-Roman writings, I actually started to see a model of the workings of imitation in Greco-Roman antiquity. And there were 5 aspects that I drew out. The first one is selection and association. So aspiring students, they choose or are presented with an exemplary person for imitation, and they start to associate themselves with that person. Then the second aspect is observation. Imitation is by nature a sensory process where one must closely observe exemplary people in order to imitate them. And then the third element, discernment. When someone studies the exemplar, the imitator must discern what is worthy of imitation. Hence, imitation should not be reduced to a mechanical process of simplistic repetition or replication. And then we have the imitation itself. So once you have observed and understood the model, then the imitator articulates this in a concrete imitative act. that shows obviously correspondence with the original example. And in that process, and that's the last element, which I call transformation. Because insofar as imitation relates to education or family, the aim is moral development, where one imitates the teacher or the parent in order to become a better person. Now, when we turn to the Jewish world, the issue becomes a little bit more complex. In the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, I could actually find only traces of imitation. The idea is there, but not really developed. We can think of texts such as Genesis 1:26, where humankind is created in the image of God. Is this imitation, or does it refer more to representation? Leviticus 19:2, where God commands the Israelites to be holy because he is holy. But actually the connection is causal. It's more the grounds or the reason why they should be holy rather than comparative when you think of imitation. Or a text like Deuteronomy 10, where saying that God looks after the outsider or the stranger, and the Israelites should also love the outsider because they were once outsiders in Egypt. But maybe this is simply analogy. More generally, Israel is often urged to walk in the way of the Lord and to follow after God. But again, this seems to refer more to obedience and allegiance than imitation. But as I said earlier, the situation began to change a bit when Greek culture started to influence Jewish thought, a process called Hellenization. And these Old Testament seeds came to fruition, as it were, in several Jewish writings of the Second Temple period. So in some way, I concluded that the pre-Greek Hebraic tradition that we have in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament cannot actually adequately explain the concept of mimesis in early Christianity. We see some of the seeds, but it's in Greco-Roman antiquity where this whole concept of imitation is really discussed. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And one of the points that you make in your book that I think is really helpful is that you talk about how the concept of mimesis is fairly pervasive in the New Testament, even when the language isn't always present. The words used relative, like the Greek word behind mimesis is used relatively few times in the New Testament, although the concept is there. So maybe talk about that dynamic a little bit. Why in the New Testament is there this disjunction between the specific number of times that New Testament writers use the language of mimesis and the concept being kind of woven throughout all of these texts?
Okay, that's a good question. It is actually quite common in biblical studies that we work with the literal terms and then a concept, and I come back on that. But just for a few facts, as you already pointed out, yeah, the Greek, the literal term, the lexeme mimestai, where we have the transliterated word mimesis from, but it simply means to imitate. It occurs 11 times in the New Testament, mainly in Paul, and 18 times in the Apostolic Fathers. But the mimetic language, as I call it, or the semantic domain of imitation is much broader than this lexeme. So in the Johannine writings, for example, there are several linguistic expressions that can indicate mimesis, such as the terms just as, likewise, or similarly. That is how I almost stumbled on this whole project when I saw simply in my English Bible that phrase, just as Jesus did, the disciples should also do. So that kind of comparative language indicates the concept, the idea of mimesis. But we have to be careful, because sometimes these terms, just as, for example, can also indicate analogy. It's not always indicating imitation, so we have to consider the context carefully. But yes, a concept can be present even when the literal term, in this case, to imitate, is not used. And it is quite common to work with concepts or ideas at a more abstract level to make sense of the text. But we must ensure that such conceptualization is still grounded in the text. So our understanding of the early Christian concept of imitation must be rooted in real words of early Christian literature. And implicitly, I critique a few scholars who use the concept rather loosely. And I think because imitation is everywhere in life, you can start to see it almost in any kind of text. Right. So I want to draw out, let's say, the kind of mimetic language that the biblical authors use. So in my book, I've tried to outline quite meticulously the mimetic language of early Christian authors, and clarify what we are looking for, and hence I also explain how mimesis or imitation differs from related concepts such as analogy, reciprocity, participation, and exemplification. Now, mimesis or imitation, whether the literal terms or even its concept, is not found everywhere in the early Christian writings or everywhere to an equal measure. But I claim that it is pervasive in the writings of John, of Paul, and the Apostolic Fathers, and to a lesser extent in Hebrews and 1 Peter. But whereas Paul and the Apostolic Fathers tend to use the standard mimetic language, that lexeme mimestai, to imitate, John develops his own mimetic idiom, primarily centered on the comparative conjunction just as. Just as Jesus washed the disciples' feet, so they also should wash the feet of one another. Just as Jesus loved the disciples, so also they should love one another. Just as Jesus was sent into the world, so also the disciples are sent into the world, and so on. So it is interesting, to play around with text and to see where the literal term comes up. That's relatively easy, but the occurrences are limited. But obviously where the idea, the concept comes up, that is where I try to argue in my book, we need to map out that mimetic language in order to get some hermeneutical control on the text.
So you talked a little bit about how there have been several New Testament scholars who have tackled this issue before, and they've maybe made it a little too broad. They've tried to apply it in context where it doesn't count. And you do engage in your book with a lot of other scholarship on this particular issue. So before you published this book, where was the field of New Testament scholarship in general as it related to mimesis? Like what has been some of the research that came before yours?
Yeah. Obviously, not many of us are really breaking new ground, doing something new that has never happened before. We just build on the work of others. But what I did notice is that it has not received much attention in current biblical scholarship. And when I started to look around in scholarship, I actually had to go back to the 1960s, where we see a different picture. And I discovered scholars like Tinsley, De Boer, Hans-Dieter Betz, Anselm Schultz, and they all produced some significant work on imitation across the New Testament. This was, well, before the time of that super specialization in biblical studies. And these studies are still relevant today. But when we fast forward to the 2000s, we still find a few scholars who have recognized the importance of imitation. And I think of scholars like Richard Burridge, Victor Copen, Jason Hood, and Candida Moss. But several issues that these scholars discussed were not settled by scholarship. So that led me to formulating 4 questions that actually shaped my inquiry. And the first question was, where do the historical origins of the early Christian concept of mimesis lie? Now, most scholars, they contend that early Christian imitation originated from the prolonged contact with Greco-Roman thought. But a few scholars make a strong case that the New Testament concept of imitation is rooted in the Old Testament. So that was one question I felt I needed to address. Now, the second question was, what language did early Christian authors use to articulate the concept of mimesis? So that flows from what we had just discussed. The literal term occurs mainly in Paul and the Apostolic Fathers, but quite a few scholars agree that the concept is broader than that. But they are not always precise in defining what in the text are we looking for. What is that kind of mimetic language? So that was something that I also felt I needed to address. And then the third question is the early Christian concept of mimesis consistent? Is it varying? Is it developing? And what is its place in early Christian ethics? Because on the surface, early Christian writings seem to distinguish between following Jesus in the Gospels, imitating Christ in Paul, and then martyrdom as the ideal imitation of Christ in the Apostolic Fathers. So we must establish the scope, the nature, the workings of mimesis in each major section of early Christian literature, and then also determine whether mimesis or imitation is central or more peripheral to these writings. And then the last question was, how could early Christians imitate an absent Jesus or Paul, and what should they imitate about them? When you think of it, mimesis or imitation flows from a sensory process where the imitator usually observes what needs imitating. But the concept of early Christian imitation seems at odds with this, because when Jesus had ascended to the Father, how could first century Christians imitate Jesus, whom they could not observe? And obviously, that's still the issue that we are dealing with. Or when Paul instructs Christians to imitate him, he's not present with the church that he is writing to. So that was an important dynamic that I also needed to investigate. How could early Christians imitate an absent Jesus or Paul, and by extension for contemporary Christians?
Yeah, and I want to start with your work on the gospel. So obviously, the Gospel of John includes this concept in a very central way to the development of his narrative. But you actually argue that in the Synoptics, it's not quite as strong as that. So just talk about the way that we see the gospel writers portraying or working with the concept of mimesis.
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good one. So that is where John is really distinct from the Synoptics. It's actually quite difficult to find a concept of imitation in the Synoptics, and maybe that's a little bit surprising for some of our hearers. The literal terms for imitation do not occur in the Synoptics, but there are quite a few scholars and people who assume that following Jesus means imitating him. After all, you can think, should the disciples, besides listening, taking in Jesus' teaching, not also learn by observing and imitating him? But then again, the crowds, they also followed Jesus, but often for the wrong reasons, and they did not imitate him. And as I mentioned earlier, to follow, because that is typically Old Testament language, Israel following Yahweh, but it also has connotations of allegiance and obedience. So I try to argue then that rather than claiming that to follow means to imitate, it seems more accurate to me to say that following Jesus can facilitate the imitation of Jesus. So in following Jesus, the disciples can or should observe and imitate him. Now there are a few instances of mimesis or imitation in the Synoptics that are relatively clear. But not very many. Let me mention two. That you find them in Matthew 5 and Luke 6. So in Matthew 5, in the Sermon on the Mount, it says that Jesus says to his audience, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." So here you have that comparative language. It's not a literal term, but that as or just as, you almost sense there is an imitation idea there. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And then in Luke, something similar, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Now, first of all, the imitation of God is quite unusual, and the Synoptic writers, they don't actually unpack this, they just mention it. Now, most scholars, when they study these verses, they agree that these two mimetic imperatives, they are rooted in the holiness command of Leviticus 19:2, which I think might have some seeds of imitation, where the Israelites are instructed to be holy because God is holy. But as I mentioned in Leviticus, we have that causal connection, because be holy because God is holy. But it is interesting that both Matthew and Luke change that causal conjunction because that we have in Leviticus into a comparative one, as or just as. So they give it explicitly a mimetic dimension. So that is the Synoptics. It's a bit more difficult, etc. John, you have a very different picture. So John, as I mentioned before, he uses the comparative language to express that concept of imitation, especially that phrase, just as. And when you repeatedly read that phrase, just as Jesus did, the disciples should also do, you just get the impression that Jesus often sets the example of ethical living for the disciples to imitate. Now, just to give you an example, and it comes from the foot washing in John 13. I think it's the most striking example to understand how it works, because the narrative vividly describes Jesus' actions. He stands up from the table, he removes his garment, and he washes his disciples' feet. And then it states in reverse order, having washed the disciples' feet, he put on his garment and reclines again at the table. And usually, one can only imitate what one observes. So instead of telling the disciples that they should wash one another's feet, Jesus shows what needs imitation. He gives a demonstration. And only after Jesus has shown this to the disciples, then he issues that command to imitate him. Then he says, "For I gave you an example that just as I did to you, you also should do." And the example that Jesus refers to, of course, is the foot washing, the visible model for imitation. Now, so far so good, you might think. But we must now consider what Jesus actually meant when he said that they should repeat what he had done for them. And scholars debating, did Jesus have in mind a literal replication of the foot washing, or is it a broad call to humble, loving service? And an important clue is to note that authentic imitation requires understanding. I had already mentioned in Greco-Roman antiquity, it was not about cloning, about a mindless replication. It was actually a cognitive, a creative process. And indeed, when Jesus goes back to the table after the foot washing, he does not immediately tell the disciples to imitate his example. Instead, he first asks them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? Do you understand what I've done to you?" Jesus checks whether the disciples have understood what he did for them. So they must interpret Jesus' example in order to imitate him. So also for John, imitation is a cognitive process where the believer, the Christian, has to interpret Jesus' example in order to imitate it. And I call this moral reasoning. That is thinking in line with God's character, God's values and norms as they are exemplified by Jesus. And this means that the imitator must understand the intent of the original act and then articulate this understanding in a corresponding imitative act. And I don't rule out a literal practice of foot washing. I think that can be very helpful, but it does not exhaust the scope of what Jesus meant. So especially in John, we see many of these examples where actually, which gives us insight into the workings of mimesis and imitation, much more than the synoptics. You have to do much harder work on them.
So I remember that when I was in like church youth group in high schools in the early 2000s in the United States, the phrase "what would Jesus do" is very popular. And you still see people wearing the bracelets or the t-shirts or whatever today. And you talk about this a little bit in your book. Given what you have been arguing about the concept of mimesis in the Gospels, what do you make of the phrase "what would Jesus do"? Is that an accurate reflection of what we're supposed to get out of the Bible? How do you handle that phrase?
Well, I wouldn't call it an accurate reflection of mimesis, but perhaps more a laudable effort to incorporate mimesis into discipleship. And yes, you're right. During the 1990s, the early 2000s, the acronym WWJD, what would Jesus do, became popular among evangelical Christians to express their desire to behave like Jesus, to imitate him. The problem is there were often no guidelines as to what people could imitate about Jesus. And I don't want to be overly critical of this popular movement, as it were, but I argue in my book that we should not leave the imitation of Jesus to purely subjective interpretation. And I suggested that the two main hermeneutical devices to guide us in discerning what to imitate about Jesus are the text and the spirit. So while we all understand or can accept, I guess, that Jesus is the supreme model for Christian behavior, this is true only to the extent that the biblical text indicates, because certain aspects or actions of Jesus cannot be imitated. So to imitate Jesus appropriately, we must determine let's say, and I'll come back to that mimetic language that the biblical authors use in order to avoid a subjective pick and mix approach. And the Spirit also has a role to play, because the Spirit, and there are plenty of texts in the Bible that indicate that they aid the Christian in the interpretation of the biblical text, and hence in determining what to imitate about Jesus. And to make a long story short, my findings indicate that the imitation of Jesus often centers on values such as humility, love, forgiveness, unity, self-giving, and other regard.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect response to that, and very important context. Now, I do want to turn to Paul, because in Paul we actually get the language of mimesis to a much greater degree than we do in the Gospels, and a lot of that comes out of First and Second Thessalonians, which were probably two of Paul's earliest letters. So, just talk to us about where we see mimesis in Paul and how that relates to his wider concept of Christian ethics.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good one, and indeed, most scholars who have done work on mimesis or imitation in the New Testament have gone to Paul. I think the idea of imitation can actually be found in all of the Pauline letters, but not always to the same extent. So yes, the literal term to imitate occurs in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, as you said, but also in 1 Corinthians, Philippians, and Ephesians. But different mimetic expressions occur in the other Pauline letters. So Paul also uses these other mimetic expressions that we also find in John, for example. But when we map out the mimetic language in the Pauline letters, I think imitation is central to Paul's ethics, primarily in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, and Philippians. It's prominent in Ephesians, but not central, and it's more peripheral in the other Pauline letters. But similar to the Gospels, the content of Paul's call to mimesis focuses on humility, self-giving love, and other regard. And this is always the issue with imitation. Paul does not spell out an exhaustive list of mimetic activities for his audience. And this is again where the concept of moral reasoning comes in. After carefully observing and studying the life of Christ, of Paul, and other exemplars, Christians must determine what to imitate about them through a creative hermeneutical process. Let me give you one example from Philippians. In chapter 2, Paul, this is after the Christ hymn, Paul tells the Philippians to work out their own salvation. I think this is a text that is sometimes misunderstood, perhaps by more popular level. But Paul is not referring here to some kind of individual works righteousness, first of all, because the you here is plural. So the reference is to a corporate activity of the Philippian church. He says to the Philippian church, work out your own salvation. But if you go a bit back into chapter 2, Paul instructs the Philippian church to cultivate moral reasoning. He uses the verb phroname. And then he presents this Christ hymn in chapter 2, 6 to 11. So he's actually saying to the Philippian church, when he exhorts them to cultivate moral reasoning, to look at Christ. And then when he issues the directive that the Philippians should work out their salvation, he's effectively saying that the corporate life of the Philippian church should be patterned on the life of Christ as exemplified in the Christ hymn of 2, 6 to 11. So he doesn't use the literal term imitation, but it is very much there.
Yeah, and with that concept in place, I think one of the most impactful books that I ever read was Michael Gorman's book Cruciformity, and I was assigned this by my Paul professor when I was in college, 16 or 17 years ago. And that book has just had a profound impact on the way that I read the New Testament and think about how I live out my faith as a Christian in the modern world. And it just so happens that Michael Gorman wrote the foreword to this book as well. So how does your understanding of mimesis and Paul correspond to his work on cruciformity?
Yeah, well, Michael Gorman and I started to converge both in our work, and we also became the good friends. Although I cannot keep up with his steady production of books, of course. But Mike's work on cruciformity explains how the Christian life is or should be shaped by the cross. And although I do not use the term cruciformity, my book shows that the cross-shaped life is achieved through imitation. And both Mike Gorman and I recognize the related concepts of participation and imitation. But I stress imitation more, and Mike focuses more on participation. For me, imitation is a subset of participation. That is to say, as believers participate in Christ, they can imitate him. And Mike, although he's primarily a Pauline scholar, in 2018 he wrote a book on John's Gospel titled "Abide and Go," and Gorman states there also that my work on Johanna and Mimesis is very close to his. And I'm indeed very grateful to Mike for his kind forward to my current book. But if you do allow me, let me make a little ad here for Mike. I want to draw attention to Mike Gorman's forthcoming book, this Baker Academic. It should come out in 2026, next year. And it will be called something like Paul and John in Sync. And not only is his mapping out of the commonalities in the theologies of John and Paul groundbreaking, it is his innovative explanation of this phenomenon that is revolutionary, namely that John influenced Paul. Yes, you hear me correct? He argues that John influenced Paul. And this book is going to challenge many scholarly consensus. So I have learned a great deal from Mike's work. I'm very grateful to him.
I can't wait for that one to come out. That's going to be a good one. The last historical biblical question I want to ask you before we turn to how we can apply this today is, where do we see the concept of mimesis throughout the rest of the New Testament, and then beyond the New Testament in the patristic period? Because you spend, you have several chapters in your book that deal with that issue. So I just wanted to give you a chance briefly to describe how we see that working out, in the later New Testament works, and then also in the period of the patristics.
Yeah. Well, in one way, there's always, when you start to look for a certain concept, there's always the desire to see it everywhere, but you have to hold back and create the right nuance. So I've tried to do that in the Synoptics, John, Paul. And looking in the rest of the New Testament, there is not much. Some people see some ideas in Revelation. I find it a bit more difficult, but I saw some references to imitation in Hebrews and 1 Peter, but the concept is not central to these writings. So let me give an example from 1 Peter. In 1 Peter 2, the author presents Christ's patient suffering, especially when mistreated, as an example for believers to imitate. Literally, it says an example so that you may follow in his footsteps. This is a particular expression that the author of 1 Peter uses, so that you may follow in his footsteps. But it is an idiom for imitation. And then there is a New Zealand scholar, Katie Marker, and she argues that the following verses depicts Jesus as the Isaianic suffering servant who is held up here as a model, especially for Christian slaves, but by extension for all believers. And she explains how Christ's suffering provides a model of endurance in the face of unjust suffering. First for slaves, but second for all believers to imitate. And she argues that the new family and ethnic identity for believers that we find in the first half of 1 Peter is connected to the moral exhortation for imitation in the second half of the letter. So that actually, in a different way, supports the findings, my findings in John and Paul, that imitation functions primarily as divine family education, as it were. So that is in the rest of the New Testament. But I went beyond the New Testament, looking at the Apostolic Fathers, so the first half of the 2nd century, because there is something significant there. The Apostolic Fathers are obviously significant for understanding the whole of early Christianity, because they are the bridge between the apostles and then the next generation of early Christian leadership. And it is during this time that the concept of martyrdom as the ideal imitation of Christ emerged. Let me give two examples. Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, who was martyred in Rome in the early 2nd century. He wrote in his letter to the Romans, and I quote, "I am the wheat of God, and let me be ground by the teeth of the wild beast, that I may be found the pure bread of Christ. Then shall I truly be a disciple of Christ. Entreat Christ for me, that by these instruments I may be found a sacrifice to God. Permit me to be an imitator of the suffering of my God." And likewise, the anonymous letter Martyrdom of Polycarp describes the death of Polycarp in the mid-century as follows, and I quote, "He was not merely an illustrious teacher, but also a preeminent martyr, whose martyrdom all desire to imitate, as having been altogether consistent with the gospel of Christ," unquote. Now, this is very interesting. This is a new development. And for us in the still relatively comfortable West, this form of martyrological imitation seems extreme, seems not mentally healthy. But perhaps we should consider the following. The claim of Martyrdom of Polycarp, that martyrdom is consistent with the gospel of Christ, is not entirely wrong, because the idea of imitating Jesus' death can be traced back, for example, through John's newly creative imitative command in 1 John, where it says, "Just as Jesus laid down his life for us, so we must lay down our lives for one another," to Jesus' own saying in John 15:13, "No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." So the New Testament already had the seeds for this emerging of this imitation of Jesus' death. At the same time, and here I rely on Candida Moss, who has done great work on this martyrological imitation. She notes the contrast between Polycarp on the one hand and another figure called Quintus, who had voluntarily offered himself for martyrdom, but he was unable to see it to completion. And so Moss concludes that, and I quote, "The gospel-worthy martyr does not offer him or herself for martyrdom, but eagerly embraces it once the sentence is passed," unquote. So while we should not seek martyrdom, it can be a legitimate and supreme imitation of Christ.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that I really appreciate about your book, and this is the final question I'm going to ask you before we wrap up, but I think this is in many ways probably the most important question. You state this in the introduction to your book, that you're writing from a specifically Christian perspective. And I've had a lot of New Testament scholars on my show that aren't writing from a Christian perspective, that just do great historical work, but there's no like practical or moral application to what they do. But with your book, you deliberately kind of argue that we actually should, as modern Christians, be thinking about the concept of imitation, and that it should shape the way that we witness our faith to the outside world. So talk about what you want your audience to get out of this book in terms of how it should shape Christian discipleship. What should we as modern Christians do with the concept of mimesis?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right. I identify myself in the book that I'm standing within the Christian tradition that I study, and I try to be a critical insider, as it were. But that also means that I think these writings were not simply written just to be studied historically, but they also have contemporary meaning. And it works very well for imitation, because it's probably not an exaggeration to state that imitation or mimesis is central to human life. Right. We are social beings. We are wired to imitate. Think of it. Babies learn to talk by imitating their parents. Children grow up imitating their parents, their teachers, other role models. Adults, they progress in their behavior and skills, often by imitating others. But people are not always aware or careful about what or whom they imitate. Many people nowadays find their role models on social media, where influencers cultivate an often uncritical following. Yeah. And my book seeks to show how Christians can be more intentional about making imitation central to discipleship. And as Christians seek to model their lives on Jesus, whether by picturing Jesus in the biblical text or by observing exemplary Christians, they gradually become more Christ-like. And then we come full circle when we realize that imitating Jesus is not simply about our personal growth, but that the ultimate challenge is to become an example for others in their Christian journey. And I think that ties into the entire Christian concept that this is a corporate message. We are together on a journey. And yes, I look around to see, to find mature Christians, to associate myself to them. And I think if you are a regular goer to a church and you know people, you will almost intuitively know, this person is gracious, or I wish I would be like this person, more patient or more hospitable, etc. And you can associate yourself to these people intentionally, study them, observe them, trying to replicate that in your own life, but even with a loftier goal in mind, that perhaps you can be a role model to others. So that is how I would apply it.
Well, Dr. Cornelis Bennema, I think this is a great place to wrap it up today. The book is Imitation in Early Christianity. Like I said before, it's out now on Eerdmans. I would highly recommend everyone in my audience to pick up a copy of this book and read it and meditate on it. It is fantastic. Before I let you go, where can people find your work?
Well, it's readily available on Amazon, both in the US and the UK. You can obviously find it also on the Eerdmans website, but otherwise, website of major the retailers such as Barnes & Noble, Eden Bookshop, etc. If you really want to be smart and want a free copy, perhaps you should contact the book editors of any major New Testament journal and ask whether you can review the book.
Perfect. Well, we appreciate the insider information there. Dr. Bennema, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Okay, it was a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.